Hey guys, Scooter Street today. We're outside today, so I apologise for a bit of the wind noise. But I've got an interesting one for you today. So if you have a Piaggio Zip 52 stroke, maybe a Sport City 1 like this here, or a Aprilia SRMT, maybe a Typhoon, there's a common issue which these scooters sometimes have, which is a bit of an unusual one, which is where it first start up in the morning, generally, they can have a really loud squeak, sort of bird chirping, terribly loud noise from the engine. It's a really unusual problem. We've encountered it a few times over the years, and seemingly there's nothing you can do to get rid of it. Well, we've got one here today which is doing it. It seems to be doing it when we push it off the centre stand. See if I can demonstrate it now, if it'll do it. There it is. Big loud one. Big horrible, horrible noise. So I'll just show you where it's coming from. So inside here, this is the forced fan for the cooling of the cylinder on the air-cooled models. Now, we've ascertained over the years that noise is coming from is the crank bearing inside the casing. So imagine you have a casing. I'll show you in a minute with an actual casing. You have the casing, the bearing sits in the casing, and then the actual crankshaft sits on the inside of that bearing. Now, what can happen with age, particularly on the Chinese manufactured Piaggios, like I mentioned, the Typhoon, Sport City 1, SRMT, and the Zip, is that over time the outside of the bearing starts to spin inside its seat in the case. Alrighty guys, I have a Piaggio 50cc engine casing here. Thought it might be a little bit easier if I can visually show you what's going on. So this is the right hand side of the casing. I've just slid a cylinder on there, just a factory cylinder to show you. So obviously exhaust is coming out here. Got your stator on this side of the casing, with that fan cover, that bowl-shaped cover with the hole in the centre of it with the fan. So this is a factory crank bearing for a Piaggio. So this is the part that's sitting in the casing and making the terrible squeal noise. So your crank actually sits through here, the shaft, and comes out the other end around here, which is where your stator and your flywheel's bolted to. So your crank's actually coming up into the piston here. So you'll see that this bearing doesn't actually really want to sit in there. Now, the way these are designed to work, generally when you're installing a crank, you heat the casing up and you cool down the bearing, so that there's just enough with that thermal difference, just enough difference in size that the bearing just really nicely sits in there. It's essentially exactly matched to the size of the casing. Now, what tends to happen with age, with some of the Chinese manufactured engines, we've noticed, is that eventually, whether it's the engine casing that wears or the actual bearing, the bearing is able to sort of come a little bit loose and turn inside the casing. Now, because it's really quite tight in there, that's where the big squeal noise is coming from, this bearing turning. Now, to the best that we can ascertain, the reason this is happening when that bike is cold, when it warms up it stops, is because as the bearing heats up, obviously it's spinning quite quickly with these balls and the cage inside there, so it's generating quite a bit of its own heat, totally aside from the fact that it's connected to the crank, which also gets quite hot. So as the bearing heats up, as it's generating more heat than the actual casing is, it heats up to a higher temperature than the casing, and again with that thermal expansion, it's expanding out, and then once it is fully heated up and fully expanded, it's large enough to completely grab onto the side of the bearing slot on the engine casing, and it stops doing the squeal. Now, the only real way that we've been able to fix this issue in the past is by getting like a sharp press, like a punch type tool, and just trying to roughen up the edges on the inside of this bearing cup on the engine casing. Just very gently punching a couple of holes, well, not holes, but punching a couple of little dents on the inside of this, so that it's just enough of a rough surface so that when the bearing goes in, it grabs onto it even when the engine's cool. So the only other real option is to replace the engine, the right hand side of the engine casing. That's quite expensive. There's no guarantee that it won't happen again in the future. So Unfortunately, this fix requires you to completely disassemble the whole engine. This is essentially one whole side of the engine casing, so the whole engine has to come out of the bike to be completely disassembled to be able to do this. So that being said, what a lot of people choose to do is just live with the squeal. It's not going to damage the engine. It eventually, over a really long time, it will eventually get bad enough that it will start causing some bearing movement and some really bad noises. And at that point, you will have to replace it. But it's going to take a very long time generally before that's going to happen. So definitely the easiest option is just to deal with the squeal, as it generally only happens when it's cold. Otherwise, you're going to be disassembling your engine and doing what we've discussed and roughing up the inside of this a little bit so that when you put new bearings in, the bearing wants to stay put.